I appreciate the topic, Acts chapter 16. Talking about women in general, and specifically tonight we're talking about Lydia. That is right. It is Lydia. See, you talked to my wife. I never got to speak with anybody, and so Danielle said, "Hey, you're talking about Lydia." And so I got it all ready to go, and I just have to trust her. And I do. So, we're going to do a few things tonight. Number one, we're going to talk about how Lydia is an example, and especially the context around Lydia. It's an example of providence. It really is, in my estimation, an example of providence. And then we'll talk about how Lydia, and really the principle of this VBS, women in general, and how the Bible treats women in general, is a good example of balance. And then we'll, of course, talk about how Lydia is an example of obedience. We're going to try to talk about all three of those things as we go through here. So when we get into Acts chapter 16, some very amazing things are going on. Of course, the first part of Acts 16, Paul is maybe not introduced for the first time, but we are introduced for the first time to a person who would be indispensable to Paul. Who is that? The beginning of Acts 16. Who is that? Timothy. And Timothy would become kind of the young sidekick of Paul, the mentee to Paul as the mentor. And that's in the first part of Acts chapter 16. But as you get on into Acts chapter 16, I'd like you to look at verse 6 beginning. Now when they had gone throughout Phrygia and the region of Galatia, and I'm going to have a map up there in just a second and we'll talk about some of that, and were forbidden of the Holy Ghost to preach the word in Asia. Let's go ahead and look at that map. If you look up here at the map, then this is Paul's second missionary journey. And what I really want to focus on, you see there right above Cilicia, you've got Lystra and Derbe. It's in that region where Paul is introduced to Timothy. Timothy is converted, and all of that takes place. And then what the text says in verse 6 is that he just went through the regions of Phrygia and Galatia. Now, Phrygia is not on this map, but Colossae would be in the region of Phrygia, okay, even though it's not on that map. And then you've got Galatia up to the northeast of that region as well. So Paul is there, and he wants to go to Asia. He wants to preach the gospel to Asia. But notice that it says in verse 6, the Holy Ghost forbade him from doing that. He wasn't allowed to do that. Well, he is not easily deterred. Verse 7, they were come to Mysia. They essayed to go into Bithynia. And so yet again, they wanted to enter into that region. Bithynia, you see up there north of Asia. I'm not going to give up that easy, Paul says. I still want to go into that region. So they wanted to go while they were at Mysia to that region of Bithynia, but the Spirit suffered them not. So that's strike two. Okay, Paul says, I want to go to a certain region and preach the gospel. And you have to, admire Paul for wanting to preach the gospel, to take the message of the gospel out there. But God said, no, I'm not going to let you do that. I wonder if you were to ask Paul at that moment, Paul, are you frustrated? I think Paul may have said, yes. Like, I've got a plan. I've got a way that I think things should go, and God's not letting me do things the way I want to do them. You ever felt that way? Okay, God, there's a certain way things need to work out here. And you need to get on board with me, God, and you need to do things the way that I want them done. Paul, if I can read his personality correctly, he was a type A personality. You remember Paul and Barnabas, what was their disagreement about? John Mark. What was the problem with John Mark? Do what? He turned back. John Mark was a young man. He either got scared or homesick or something. And Paul doesn't have time for that. Look, I don't have time to bring some young man along with me who's not ready to do the work. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a mentor in that sense. I'm here to work. And if you're not going to work with me, go home. Now, was Barnabas that way? No, Barnabas was patient. He was a teacher. But Paul, type A all the way. It's my way or the highway. I'm a get-it-done kind of person. And that was Paul. Okay? So Paul wants to go into Asia. Paul wants to go in Bithynia. And the Spirit says, no, I'm not going to let you do that. Now, verse 8. They passing by Mysia came down to Troas. So you see, Troas is there to the west of that region of Asia on the coast. Okay, you see that up there, and you follow that dotted line that goes through his second missionary journey. Well, in verse 9, a vision appeared to Paul in the night. And there stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." So that essentially is strike three for any plan Paul had. The Spirit has suffered him twice not to do what he wanted to do, and now the third time he has a vision with the man from Macedonia. Hear the Macedonian call today. Don't we sing that song? It's rooted and grounded in this very passage right here. He has a vision of a man from Macedonia saying, "Come over here." Okay? And help us. Verse 10, after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. Well, that's a pretty good assumption. Since you had a vision about a man from Macedonia saying, "Come preach to us," that probably means that God wants you to come preach to them. Now, you ask yourself, what in the world does that have to do with Lydia? Let's go, if you would, to verse number 14. A certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple. Now somebody tell me where the text says she was from. Where's she from? They can speak. Is this kind of Bible class setting, is how I treat this. She's from the city of where's Thyatira? What region of that map is it in? It's in Asia. Paul wanted to go to Asia, and God said no. But I'm going to get the gospel to Asia. It might not be in the way that you think, but I'm going to do it. You see, that's the amazing thing about God's plan. It doesn't always work out the way we want it to work out, but it always works out the way God wants it to work out. The gospel was going to get to Asia whether Paul stepped foot there or not during this missionary journey. You see, because Lydia got her purple from the city of Thyatira, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I guarantee you she made trips there on a regular basis. So the gospel was going to get there one way or another, just not in the way that Paul thought it was going to. So you think about providence. What is providence? We throw that word around. What even is that? What's that mean? Oh yeah, I forgot that didn't work. What is providence? We see it in several other places throughout the Old and New Testaments. My favorite is Esther chapter 4. You want to ask yourself what providence is. You see it at work there and sort of described in Esther there. You remember that there was a crisis in the kingdom because Haman wanted to have all of the Jews slaughtered. And he had convinced the king to do that through sort of trickery. He'd kind of gotten some legislation passed to do that. But Esther was the queen. She had been placed there. How had Esther become queen? Had some miracle taken place that had put her in the kingdom? Okay, that's right. The first queen fell out of the king's favor, and so there was this campaign undertaken to find a new queen. And why did he choose Esther? She's beautiful. She conducted herself in a godly manner. We could talk. You talk about women of the Bible. Do y'all talk about Esther in this? Oh, she's a great woman, a very godly, upstanding woman, as she's depicted here in the book of Esther. And so there's nothing miraculous that takes place to get her in this position, but God's at work. Providence is God using the actions of man and the things that happen in life to accomplish His purpose. God doesn't have to swoop down and perform a miracle to accomplish His purpose. God can use you and me. He can use evil. He can use good. He can use godly governments and godless governments. He can do anything He wants to. Who did He use to get Israel out of Egypt? Well, He used Pharaoh making bad decisions to get his people out of Egypt. Well, look at Esther chapter 4 and verse 14. Mordecai, Esther's uncle, has this to say to Esther, because Esther says, if I go to the king, he has the right to kill me, right? So I got to be careful how I go to him. If thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance Arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Maybe God put you here providentially for this purpose. Have you ever asked yourself the question, why has my life turned out the way that it has? Are there opportunities that God is giving me through providence to do His will? It was the case that Lydia was an opportunity for Paul to get the gospel to the region he wanted to go, to Asia. Esther had an opportunity. In Revelation chapter 3, one of the 7 churches of Asia, one of them is Philadelphia. If you look back at that map this region here, the 7 churches of Asia are in that region there that's labeled Asia. Philadelphia was sort of a gateway to the northern part of that region that we see up there on the map. Philadelphia was a door to a good portion of the Roman world. And if you'll notice in Revelation chapter 3, what does Jesus tell the church at Philadelphia? I have given thee what? An open door that no man can shut. I've given you an opportunity by providence, by sheer geography. You have an opportunity. Take advantage of it. If you look around at your life, how many opportunities do you and I have to talk to people about the gospel just by the very fact of where we work, where our house is located, where we get our oil changed, where we buy our groceries, things. We don't have to change a single thing about our lives, and right here are opportunities. Jesus told the church at Philadelphia, you are an open door. Make use of it. Take advantage of it. And that's providence at work. We don't have to have miraculous things happen in order for God to accomplish His purpose. And that's what you see. In Matthew chapter 25, there's a parable about a Lord who left money to His servants. And how was the Lord going to be prospered? Who was going to see to it that that Lord's money was increased? Well, those servants that he left it to. He didn't say, I'm going to conjure up some miraculous way for this money to multiply. No, it's going to multiply by hard work and effort and dedication. The whole principle of that parable is simply this. Make use of what God gives you, right? The villain of that parable is the one-talent man who went and hid it in the earth because he was afraid of doing something wrong. How many opportunities do you and I pass up because we're afraid? We are afraid to talk to this person. We're afraid to confront this issue. We're afraid to take advantage of that opportunity. You see, providence, it's opportunities given us, and it's up to us to take advantage of those. When you think about providence, and we're going to get back to Lydia here in just a second more specifically, but when you think about providence, some things that really jump out at us from Acts 16, from Esther 4, from Revelation 3, and other passages where you see it. Always remember that God can see the beginning and the end. Song when I was growing up by Garth Brooks, Unanswered Prayers. Now the title of that song is misleading. For the Christian, are there really unanswered prayers? What 3 ways does God answer prayer? Yes, no, and? Maybe. Later. Wait a while, right? Yes, no, wait a while. Well, in that song, essentially what Garth Brooks says is, things turned out better in a way that I didn't expect for it to turn out. You know, I'm happy with the person I'm with, she's happy with the person she's with, and neither one of us really have as much in common now as we thought we did at one point in time. And hey, I look at my life, there are lots of things that I wanted to turn out a certain way, and they didn't turn out that way, and I'm glad they didn't. I'm glad. I wanted to marry 2 girls, one at different times, before I finally met Danielle. I thought, yeah, I'm going to marry this one, you know. Yeah, I'm going to marry this one. But it was this one. And every other domino that's fallen in my life since then is related to that decision. You see? Providence. Now, can we definitely say, ooh, that's providence, or ooh, that's providence. But God works in life through our decisions, and the decisions of those around us. And we see it perfectly illustrated in Acts chapter 16, number 2. Opportunities must be taken. God is not going to kick you through a door. He's not going to speak for you in an opportunity. He will merely place doors before you. It's up to you and me to go through those doors. Paul, Luke, because it says we in the context of Acts 16, and others were there at the river where the women were praying. It was up to them to execute the plan that God had put right before them. It was up to them. Do what? Put this down because it's useless? Yeah, I just have to hold something. It's my comfort here, okay? You want me to just hold this instead? Okay, I'll hold this. Number 3. So you take your wife places and she does this kind of stuff. Number 3, God's purpose will be accomplished no matter what. That's a given. You know what the book of Revelation is all about? Number 3, God will win. God's purpose will be accomplished. Is the Roman government persecuting you? Yes. Are there going to be persecutions in the future? Yes. But guess what? God's purpose will be fulfilled. God will work His work. Pharaoh could either let the people go the first time or he could let the people go the 10th time. God's purpose was going to be fulfilled. Paul could either go to Asia or he could go to Macedonia. But the gospel was going to get to Asia. God's purpose will be fulfilled. The question is, are we a part of the plan in a positive way for us? Or are we part of the plan in a negative way for us? That's the only question. Are you with Him or against Him? His plan's going to work. Are you on the train or not? And that's what you see in Acts chapter 16. Paul wanted to do it a certain way. God said, no, we're doing it my way. But the purpose will be fulfilled. And that's those 3 important lessons you learn about providence. Number 2, we learn something about God's treatment of women in general. And every time I'm asked to speak about women, any woman, I want to mention this. Because, for instance, when I went to the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, I had this study group. I was an English major, and you get all kinds of wackos that come out of the woodwork in the English department, you know. And I'm an English major, so don't take any offense if you are, because we're in the same boat. So we would have this study group, and you had these really strong feminists, and they would just rail on Christianity. Well, women are degraded in Christianity, and the Bible just really tears down women. And not really. Not if you really approach the Bible from an objective standpoint. And if you do, you see that nothing could be any farther from the truth. Let's go to Acts 16. Let's look a little bit at who this woman Lydia is. Now, in Acts chapter 16 and verse 14, a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken by Paul. Now, Lydia, I've always assumed, and I still believe, that Lydia is her proper name, but she's from the region of Lydia. So Lydia from Lydia. So either one of a couple things is true. Either number 1, they're calling her region. If I moved to Minnesota, it might be fitting for the people I worked with, if I worked there, to call me Tennessee. Hey Tennessee, how you doing? Because I'm the only one from there, right? Well, she's in Macedonia. She might very well be the only seller of purple from Thyatira in Macedonia. So could they very well call her Lydia because she's from there? Possibly. But it's also possible Lydia was a very common name in the first century. So it may be the case that that's her given or common name. Some commentators have tried to say, well, since she's connected with the churches in Macedonia, maybe in Philippians where it talks about Euodias and Syntyche, maybe one of those or one of the other ladies that's mentioned in the next verse, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 3, maybe that one of those is this lady, and her given name is not really Lydia. Look, I don't know about any of that. I wanted to throw that out there for you. But we call her Lydia, and that's how she's described, for whatever reason, in this text. But not only is she described as that, she's also described as one who worshiped God. She was a proselyte. Every time that phrase worshiped God is used in that way, translated from that Greek word, it references a Jewish proselyte. So she was a Greek who had been brought into the Jewish faith. So she was like Cornelius, and she was like many other prominent members of the New Testament who already were devout in their religion towards the God of heaven, but they needed to be redirected towards Christ. And so Lydia, in a manner of speaking, probably was a fairly easy convert because she had a foundation to work with. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But what's very interesting here is you've got a single lady mentioned in the New Testament as a prominent member of society. Was that very common? Not common at all. In fact, in some parts of the world, it still is today. And you see this in this makes the news on occasion. Are there cultures where women are less than second-class citizens today? Islam tries to get around it any way they can in popular culture, but Islam despises women. I mean, in many Islamic countries, the woman has to walk so many feet behind the man. She has to be veiled at all times in public. The man has complete and total control over her. Just recently, there was a young woman who was killed by her brother because she was a fashion model and was violating the social norms of that Muslim country. And her brother had the right, under that Muslim code, to murder her. In fact, he was expected to do it. Now, that culture is not too awfully far removed from some of the cultures you might have seen, especially in the Old Testament, but even as you get into the New Testament. But then we see a woman here who was unmarried. Now, was she a widow? Perhaps. Was she just unmarried? I don't know. But this woman at this time was obviously unmarried because there's no mention of her husband. And a woman traveling alone, even in this situation, who was married would be unheard of. And if her husband was around, he would have been mentioned. Okay, so we can assume that she was unmarried. She was apparently wealthy. How do we know that? She had a household, which means she had servants. And she was a seller of purple. How many of you old school folks or people who cook that way know how they made the coloring for red velvet cake before you got red food coloring? Any of you older ladies? You can self-describe yourself as an older lady. I'm not going to choose you out. You know what? Beets. Beets. Why? Because there was a time when you couldn't just go to the store and get red food coloring, blue food coloring, purple coloring. And you could, this color blue wasn't necessarily readily available. So if there was, for instance, a sea creature that produced this color, or a flower that produced this color, or that color or the other, it was in very high demand. Synthetic coloring was not around at this time. So if you dealt in coloring, especially hard to find dyes like purple, then you were very wealthy. She traveled for her occupation. She was a woman of high social standing. Not only that, if you go to Acts chapter 16, notice in verse 13, on the Sabbath day now that's the narrator Luke bringing himself into the narration, so Luke is with them. On the Sabbath day, verse 13, we went out of the city by a riverside. When's the bell going to ring, by the way? Okay, the final bell. Okay. Went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spake unto the women which resorted thither. So Paul and his company came into a new city, and where's the first place they went? To the river. Why? To talk to whom? The women. Oh, but these women are second-class citizens. The Bible doesn't like women. Well, then why did Paul choose first to go to the ladies? And why did he choose out of among these ladies an unmarried woman of high social status? And why did he say nothing about the fact that she was unmarried? And why did he not degrade her in any fashion because she didn't have a family, it seems? Because he respected her as a soul, as a human being. Okay? Don't take this idea that feminist movement tries to give us today that the Bible degrades women. That's not the case in Acts 16, and that's not the case throughout the Old and New Covenants. Just a quick survey of how the Bible feels about women. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, it's interesting what the Bible has to say about women. People say, well, in the Old Testament, they hated women. You know, God really degraded women in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 16 and verse 11, thou shalt rejoice before the Lord. He's talking about the Passover feast. Now, who is worthy to celebrate in the Passover? Listen to this, verse 11. And thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God, thou, thy sons, thy daughters, thy manservants, thy maidservants, strangers, fatherless, the widow that are among you. Everybody. Did women here in Deuteronomy 16:11 seem to be second-class citizens? No. Not any more than anybody else in the society. And they all were on equal footing when it came to celebrating the Passover feast. In Genesis chapter 24 and verse 58, when Rachel was about to be married, guess what her family did? They asked her if she was willing to be married. Do you know how big a deal that was in that culture? In many cultures today, arranged marriage is a very popular thing. And by the way, did you know that in cultures where there's arranged marriage, the divorce rate is lower? You know, our children say, oh, you've got to give me the right to date whomever I choose because then I won't be happy. Happiness is something that is developed. Okay? Whether or not you choose your partner has less to do with happiness than most of us think it does. But you can see other passages there in the Old Testament. You read through them, it's very, very interesting. In Judges chapter 4, who was the judge in chapter 4, by the way? Deborah. Deborah was the judge. Verse 5 says, she sat under a tree and people came to her to hear judgments. But the Bible hates women. But Deborah was a judge. You know what she did? She bossed a man around and told him to go to battle. And when he didn't want to do it, she had to go do it for him. But women are hated by the Bible. We see over and over again that's simply not the case. And of course, women are celebrated in the new covenant. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, husbands, lord over your wives and dictate over them and become a tyrant. What does it say in 1 Peter 3:7? Husbands, you better have it memorized. Your husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. Know your wife. Now, is the wife to be in submission to her husband? Yes. The very fact that God has to command a wife to be in submission to her husband says that by her nature she's equal to him. You don't have to command a dog to submit. It's a dog. It's naturally not on par with me. We had a little stray dog that came up, housebroken, greatest thing ever. We call it the Providence dog. Okay, his name's Racer, but this is Providence here because it showed up housebroken. A little dog, and we love it. That dog, it seemed like the moment it walked up, it knew that I was the daddy. I didn't have to say, now dog, I'm the daddy. It knew that. God made man and woman equal. But He said, woman, if you want to be pleasing to me, take a role of submission in the household. Why? Because I have chosen for the man to take the leadership role in the house. Because somebody has to, and that's the way that I've designed it. But husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. Husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. Don't lord over them. We see how it's characterized in the New Testament so much differently than the world tries to characterize it for us. So whenever I talk about women in the Bible, I have to talk about that. Now, in the time that, what you said, 15? I got 2 minutes? There's no way. Okay, she's an example of obedience, all right? This is the main part of the lesson. Number one, Lydia had a foundation. As we said, she was a proselyte. If you are to be successful, and if I'm to be successful in my Christian life, I must have a foundation. Our children must have foundations. We build that foundation, and then it's so much easier for the rest of their lives to go the way that they and God want it to go. But if we try to build Christianity on a shaky foundation, it will not stand. Matthew chapter 7, the wise man built his house upon a rock, and the foolish man on the sand. Lydia had a foundation. We need it as well. Number two, Lydia heard the disciples. Look at Acts chapter 16 and look at verse 14. She heard us. Every parent knows there's a difference between hearing and listening, isn't there? There's a massive difference between hearing and listening. In Luke chapter 9, in verse 44, Jesus said, "Let these sayings sink down into your ears." Don't just hear me, listen to me. That's what Jesus expects us to do. There are some of us who have heard preaching and teaching of the Bible our whole lives, and it just goes in one ear and out the other. How many people do you know in your life, and I hear this all the time, but they know what they're supposed to do? I don't know why they don't do it. It's because they've heard it their whole lives. They just haven't listened. And there's a massive difference between hearing and listening. She heard and listened. Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing, hearing by the Word of God. Number 3, she had an open heart. Now, people make a lot out of this, the way it's phrased in verse 14, whose heart the Lord opened. Did God miraculously come down and break open her heart? I'll submit it to you this way. God opened her heart the same way He hardens other people's hearts. Now, if you believe that God hardens people's hearts, then that makes God a respecter of persons, and God specifically says He is not. Now, how was Pharaoh's heart hardened? An option was placed before him by God, and he made a choice. That's how it happened. And the same is true when our heart is opened. God places before us a choice, and when we make the right choice, our heart is opened. How did God open her heart? Because He sent Paul to her. And the message was preached, and she heard it. She had an open heart. Number next, she had an attentive mind. It says, you're just going to have to ring the bell, I guess, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of by Paul. But look at next. She had an obedient response. She was baptized, but the text doesn't say that anybody said anything about baptism. Anytime the gospel is preached in the New Testament, baptism is mentioned. How do I know that? Acts chapter 8. Philip preached Christ in verse 5. And what did the people do? They were baptized. He preached Christ in verse 35 to the eunuch, and he was baptized. Preaching Jesus includes everything that goes along with it. Well, I have to stop there.